Hi, welcome to Speak Up for Our Planet. We're glad that you found us. All of our videos are of experts talking about what they're doing to save the planet and how you can help too. You might like to watch the videos live and ask the expert questions. In that case, just visit our website and click Join Us. Hope to see you soon. Welcome to the first Speak Up for Our Planet event of 2026. We are focusing this year on positive actions and positive people. Because if we get downhearted, we put less energy into the things we care about, and we don't want less energy, we want more energy. So stay positive, listen to positive people, and for goodness sake, don't watch the news. If you're not on our mailing list already, look at the website above my head and you'll find there's a button which says join us or something a bit like that. And then you'll be automatically informed every time there's another event in the calendar. And all of our 5.5 years worth of talks are available on the website on a section which is called Events Library. You can watch any of them on YouTube. So to this evening, usual messages. We will be recording this talk and putting it on YouTube. So if you don't want your face to appear on YouTube, please switch your camera off. Please mute during the talk. And if you have questions, and I'm really hoping you will, because I've promised Martin that this is a great group of people for questions, put them in the chat and we will organise them and feed them to Martin in a sensible order. So our speaker this evening is Martin Sutton. We go back a long way, as they say. The very first inaugural meeting of Speak Up for Our Planet, which was held in September 2020, we had 3 speakers, one of whom was Martin. And we were so impressed with him that it's taken us 5.5 years to invite him back. Mind you, he's only the second person we've invited back, so make of that what you will.
I feel honoured.
You are. So in 2025, Martin did a very brave thing. He handed in his notice and he went off and did a degree in sustainable business management. And he has been talking to and listening to all sorts of people in the sustainable field. And so I'm sure he's learned an enormous amount about it as a result. And I'm going to let him tell you more. Over to you, Martin.
Well, thank you, Jane, and thank you for the introduction and welcome. Welcome to my basement. Now, when we bought this house in 2003, this basement had been a private gymnasium. I saw it more as a party place, and boy, we've had some good parties here since 2003. But now it's a godsend because behind me is a sofa bed, and this is where my wife and I more and more frequently find ourselves during the summer months. So the longest we've been here in any one stretch is 1 month in the heat wave of 2022. But it's becoming vital, as you guys will know, to learn how to adapt to a very different climate than we lived in 25, 30 years ago. As Jane said, I've been very fortunate to be able to step away from the world of work for a little while and indulge in learning and education around the topic of sustainability. And I spent most of 2025 studying. I completed a postgraduate certificate with the Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership, otherwise known as CISL. And I then started a master's with the University of Cambridge in sustainability. And in between those 2 courses, I went to one or two conferences and met or saw some of the rock stars of the climate world speaking and talking at these conferences. So I want to reflect back to you some of the things that I've learned over particularly the last 12 months, because I'm sure that there are times when you feel that you're almost caught between an argument of teenagers where one teenager is shouting, "We're doomed," and another teenager is shouting, "It's a con." And of course, this argument about whether climate change is real, whether it's driven by fossil fuels or not, I suspect that you, as an audience, would come down very heavily on the side of the teenager arguing, "We're doomed." But I hope, and I will try to make the case, that there is still a cause for hope. But we have to be realistic about this. We have to take on board the sober assessments that are coming out from the experts. And one of the best places to go for that sober assessment, if you haven't yet, is to listen to the national emergency briefing that was given by a number of experts to politicians in Westminster back in November. It's available on YouTube if you just search the national emergency briefing. The individual videos of those experts come up. And the briefing is very sober indeed. Professor Tim Lenton talks about how there are no scientists, serious scientists left who believe we will be able to keep global warming, or we should say global heating, to under the 1.5 degree target set in the Paris Agreement. Curiously, no one ever mentions compared to what. So global average temperatures, this is taking a calculation of all the temperature ranges across the globe, prior to the industrial age, is estimated to have been around 13.5 to 14 degrees centigrade. And the key thing about that is that's been stable for the last 10, 12,000 years since the last ice age, which coincides with when farming started. And one of the key risks that came out from the National Emergency Briefing is around food security. Because, of course, if the climate patterns become unpredictable, then agriculture becomes impossible. And the briefing led from food security will lead to risks around social order and national security. So it is a very sober briefing. And the experts were very clear that these hazards are facing us now and facing our governments now and in the future over the next 20 or 30 years. Because the reality is, this is the least extreme weather we will face for the remainder of our lifetimes. So that's the sober briefing. That's the reality that we're facing. And of course, this is a problem that's been largely generated by the global north, and the global south has been facing into these issues for years already. So where can we take hope from? Is there cause for hope? So I want to describe to you 3 areas where I believe there is still room for hope. Although, as Chris Patman said, the window for hope is getting horrendously short. But there is still hope. So the first area I'd point to is China. So as I'm sure you well know, China is responsible for around 35% of global emissions. It's now historically the second largest emitter of carbon. But in 2024, according to the Boston Consulting Group, it invested $659 billion into green technology. That's way ahead of Europe at around 410 and the US at 300. China leads the way in all the technology areas, and its investment has driven many of the new technologies to what are called positive tipping points, where they've now become cost competitive with historical technologies. And that is why solar power, wind power is now competitive with fossil fuel power generation. That's why EVs are competitive with traditional vehicles, and why battery technologies are really revolutionizing electricity storage. So China is one big reason why there is a cause for hope. However, there's no question about it. It is creating new geopolitical tensions, as the news, particularly of the first few weeks of this year, really illustrate. A key point around America's interests in Greenland is rare earths, because China has a total stranglehold on the supply of rare earths, which are necessary for these new technologies. So whilst there's a cause for hope, there's no question new geopolitical tensions have to be managed. The second area for hope is what I'd describe the difference between what you hear is going on and what is really going on. If you haven't come across this book and read it, I strongly recommend it. It's a book called Factfulness by Hans Rosling. And in it, he describes a number of reasons why our perception of the world tends to be more negative than the reality. One of the key reasons is the news. As Jane said, don't read the news. And one of the reasons for that is that the news is always there to tell us the bad news. That's their job. You cannot and should not expect to get good news from the media. You have to look elsewhere for good news. But just because they're always telling us the bad news, that isn't a reflection of the reality or the totality of the reality of the world. And a couple of anecdotes from people I've met and talked to over the last 12 months illustrate this. So one of my fellow students, who's American, chirpily said to us, "Just remember, guys, there are many governments in the US. The federal government is just one of them." And that correlates with a comment that a delegate made at one of the conferences I went to, the Global Tipping Points conference in July, where the delegate said 3/4 of the US GDP is in states that have committed to the green transition. So there is one cause for hope. Another one was a director of sustainability for a major US corporation. And she said to me, yes, of course, since the change of administration, we've had to change our language. But underneath the bonnet, she said, fundamentally, not a lot has changed. She said, we're a worldwide corporation. And where we are making new investments, we're always using renewable energy for those investments, because that's what makes commercial sense. So here's another cause for hope, is actually that commercials are beginning to tip in favor of the green economy. And that report by the Boston Consulting Group I referred to a little earlier, that has just been issued for the World Economic Forum that's going on this week. And in that report, they assess that the size of the global green economy is now $5 trillion. And they say it's set to grow to $7 trillion by 2030. From their research, they conclude that companies that are involved in the green economy are enjoying faster growth, cheaper debt, and higher valuations than traditional companies. However, we still need to keep the sober dose of reality, because the IMF and the World Bank forecast that the 2025 global economy was around 110 to 120 trillion. So the green economy at 5 trillion is great, it's there, but it's still less than 5% of the total. So there is a long way to go, but it's moving in the right direction. It is a cause for hope. The next area that I point to for a cause of hope is what I've seen, and I would say is the groundswell of activity going on around the world. One of the other things that Hans Rosling pointed to in his book on factfulness is we'll always hear about the extremes. That's certainly what the media wants to do, the extremes of the two arguments. But his tip is look for where the majority is. So the majority of countries representing the majority of the world's population still very much back the IPCC, very much back climate science, haven't rejected it, haven't pivoted away from it. And that is reflected in many of the discussions I've had, where many remarkable people are doing great work on the ground. And I'll give you a few examples. I came across this guy at the Global Tipping Points conference, which was held down at the University of Exeter. And he bought, some 10, 15 years ago, 200 hectares of land in Brazil. And he rewilded this land, 200 hectares. It used to be rainforest, but it had been cleared of rainforest. Now, that is a drop in the ocean compared to the size of the loss of the Amazon rainforest. But from that, publication came out about cooling the climate through reforestation. And at that conference, representatives from the Brazilian government were speaking about their ambitions for rolling back the deforestation, for reforesting as much of the Amazon as they can. Now, obviously, there is going to be significant vested interests they will have to overcome. But just the fact that government representatives were talking about the intent gave me hope. Just the fact that an individual had gone and rewilded 200 hectares gives me cause for hope. And I came across other individuals. So one of my fellow students at Cambridge, he runs a program in the South Punjab in Pakistan, where he works with small village communities to provide them with renewable energy, largely through solar panels, so that they can continue to farm and produce low carbon cotton so that they can continue to stay within the supply chains for the global fashion industry, which is now more and more demanding low carbon cotton into its supply chains. And then here in the UK, there are many people doing much great work. So there's one I would highlight, the Bioregional Learning Centre. So this is an initiative that is in Devon, focused around, I believe, the River Exe, where instead of working at a sort of local authority level and these artificial boundaries, it's working with a bioregional boundary, so taking a watershed and a fluvial system and working with the communities within that watershed to regenerate the area, to increase the resilience from climate change, to adapt to climate change. So there are initiatives going on all over the world, and I have seen examples of hundreds of them, from very small scale to national scale. There's a wonderful lady who was speaking at the Global Tipping Points conference from Malaysia, describing how the Malaysian government has adopted, as part of the core curriculum for every single degree subject, planetary health. That is a part of the teaching that every student will get. So there's a vast number of initiatives. I'm convinced of this. And that groundswell of action will be making a huge difference. And the students that I'm studying with come from every single continent on the planet. They're from all over. And then the final place that I would say go to for hope is the book, The Book of Hope, written by Dr. Jane Goodall with Douglas Abrams. And Dr. Jane Goodall, I'm sure you know, was this amazing environmentalist, did all the work with chimpanzees down in Tanzania. And her book is utterly inspiring. So she points to 4 factors that gives us cause for hope. The first one is the amazing human intellect, our ability to solve problems. And if you just take the Boston Consulting Group report, it's so much evidence that we can solve the problems. 50% of emissions we can solve already. We've got the technologies, we've got the answers. 50% of the hard to get is being invested in, and solutions will come, I'm sure of it. The second reason Dr. Jane Goodall said we can be hopeful is the resilience of nature itself. There's plenty of evidence that when nature is left alone, it will restore and regenerate very quickly. The third reason she gave is the power of youth. Now, she started the Roots and Shoots initiative in Tanzania so that young people could start to have a direct impact on their local environment. That initiative now operates in 65 countries around the globe. And I see it in my own daughter. At the moment, she's studying biology, but she is very focused on how is she going to work and contribute to sustainability. And she is not alone. I've come across so many young people, both students with me at Cambridge and elsewhere, who are determined to make a difference through the green economy and through sustainability. And then the final reason that Jane pointed to for a cause for hope is the indomitable human spirit. We will keep fighting. We will keep working, even if the odds really are stacked against us. That is what human beings have done countless times through the course of history. And there is no question I am coming across loads of humans who are going to do the same this time around. So there we have it. I hope I've given you some reasons for cause for hope, whether that's China, whether that's looking at what's really going on versus what we hear in the media, or whether that's what is the groundswell of activity right across the planet. Because I should mention, actually, that in the research I did for my postgraduate certificate, I was talking to companies from Sweden to Bangladesh, from the UK to Mexico, that are rolling out sustainable business models to either protect their environment, improve human well-being, and reduce emissions. So there are lots of reasons for hope. However, we have to accept we are where we are. We have to accept the sober reality from the briefings, say, for example, the National Emergency Briefing. So we are going to have to adapt. We're going to have to dramatically adapt our properties, our businesses, our societies, our environment for the climate that is going to come anyway. But we can and must keep hopeful that the work that is going on all around the world to find the solutions will keep going and will succeed in the end. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you very much indeed. Exactly as I thought, you speak with enormous authority and have given us lots and lots of reasons for hope. So we're going to ask you questions that have popped up on the screen, and actually there are several in my head as well, so we won't have any shortage. First of all, can I just write down in the chat so people have it, the 2 books you mentioned? Jane Goodall's book is called?
The Book of Hope.
Okay, that's a goodie.
Yeah. Its subtitle is A Survival Guide in Trying Times.
Very good. All right. I'm just writing with Jane Goodall, The Book of Hope. And the other one was uh,
Factfulness.
Fact with a C
No,
in it.
fact. Fact.
Yeah,
Fullness.
Factfulness. Got it? By
Hans Rosling. Rosling.
Rosling.
Yeah.
Got it. All right. So people can go and look those up. Okay. So the first question we have is, how is the work in Brazil funded? It sounds great, but it also sounds expensive.
Uh, that's a good question. I actually don't know the answer. I'm curious. I was curious to find out as well. But um, I was speaking to Rob and one or two others, and it's clear fundraising is a key part of these initiatives, as they were talking about. The challenge with fundraising that there's always been, but there's no question that 2025, which as the UK Geographical Magazine described the year the world changed, funding has become a lot more challenged. So uh, I do hope these sort of initiatives have enough momentum that they will keep going. And certainly, one of the big pieces of feedback from the CEO of CISL, where I'm studying, has been that whilst following the change in US administration, that has seen some Western companies be a bit more reluctant or a bit quieter about what they're doing. It's not changed anything in the East. And in fact, she highlights the risk that is already very much there is that with the East, particularly China, still investing and motoring away, that there's going to be an awful lot of technology that is developed over there that we don't have over here. So, whilst there's overall hope, again, there's these geopolitical and trade tensions.
Mm.
One of the big things I've learned with sustainability is there are no easy answers and there's no simple trade-offs.
No, but as you're implying, there's a lot of movement from the ground up, young people getting much,
Yeah.
much more energized about all of this. Rosie asks, she says, I see hope in the way many businesses find their staff are looking for their employer to provide more sustainable products and processes. Do you have examples coming from your conversations and research of that kind of thing? But young people actually putting pressure on their employers.
Well, so my last employer, Spa Healthcare, consistently the feedback was coming through that our employees wanted us to do more. Um, and Spa Healthcare's employee profile is not actually particularly young. Lots of the employees were in the sort of 50 to 60 age bracket. But if you look at healthcare, which is the sector I've been in, one of the joys of doing my postgraduate certificate was that allowed me to research sustainability in healthcare in much greater detail. And I had no idea until I started doing that research just how much work is going on, again, right around the world to try and make healthcare systems far more sustainable. So, as you probably can well imagine, hospitals are energy intensive and resource intensive when it comes to hydrocarbons because of lots of plastic. And one of the big challenges is we haven't invented an alternative to plastic, which is so good when it comes to handling products that are either contaminated or drugs or the infection prevention control that you get from plastic is really second to none. But there are an enormous number of initiatives of how we can reduce the reliance on plastic and how we can, for example, make surgery, which is the most carbon intensive healthcare activity, uh, less intensive in terms of its carbon. Um, And so, you know, just the healthcare industry itself is there has been amazing work, and that's been going on for years. The NHS started its green work back in 2008 when the UK Parliament passed the 2008 Climate Change Act. So, uh, but you know, most of the members or the students on my course, I would say, are but certainly under 40 years old. And they are very much, you know, already, many of them are already driving action and change in their countries, in their companies. So yeah, I'm really, I take a lot of energy from these people. And, you know, for those of us who are getting at the more mature end, um, I think it's all about how can we help and support the younger people make the change. We've got to make sure we don't get in their way, if you see what I mean. And it's more enabling and supporting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it's interesting because we don't hear about these initiatives in the NHS and similar things like that, but it's good to hear that they're happening. So Alan has said something here which isn't stated as a question, but I think probably what he means is, could you comment on this? He says, I like your mention of the power of youth as a reason for hope. However, I despair at the lack of leadership in explaining both the urgency and the criticality of the change needed.
Yeah. Well, it's it's been something that actually that I found really interesting debating with a number of people over the course of the year around this point about communication. There was a delegate, I forget her name now, but she was somebody who's done a lot of work in the media industry, and she was one of those who is very critical of the climate movement in terms of its communication. And I think part of the problem is because IPCC, the UN sponsored body, has taken, shall we say, a very scientific line along explaining what's going on and what it's predicting. It's a language that's very hard to understand. And the terminology has changed, which is probably unhelpful to try and almost just fit in with the political environment. So we've moved from global warming to climate change. My view is we should be talking about heating, but it's also very difficult to communicate concepts where our actions now will have an impact further down the line. It's not an immediate impact. And human beings are very good at doing things now that have a long-term negative impact, but a short-term sort of positive high. We love drinking, smoking, taking recreational drugs. These are things that humans are well versed at doing and have been doing for centuries, but ultimately damage their health. And you know, fossil fuels is in a sense in that sort of category, but it's also half the problem, or more than half the problem. The real crux of the problem is that if you think about the global system and think of it as a system, a series of vast number of interconnections, at the moment, it makes entire rational sense for every single human being to use as much fossil fuels as they can, because that's the quickest and cheapest and easiest way to increase their standard of living and their quality of life. I mean, I look around my house and I mean, it's virtually entirely dependent on fossil fuels. But the problem is, it's what's known as the tragedy of the commons, is that the more and more and more we keep going, at some point, we will create the breakdown in our climate because, of course, the fossil fuel emissions are heating, the carbon dioxide is absorbing energy and heating the climate. And then we will all suffer collectively. The suffering is uneven at this point in time. The global north is beginning to experience some of the things that the global south has been experiencing, but it's only relatively recent that we're really seeing the sort of heat waves, the wildfires, the floods. But it is here, it's happening. So, yeah, it's a very difficult thing for scientists to have communicated. And politicians have found it's a very difficult thing to convince their populations that this is something they need to make change and potentially sacrifice at this point in time. And I really relate to that because I'm finding it so damn hard to change myself. I still eat meat. I want to eat less of it. I still drive hydrocarbon powered cars. At the moment, switching to the new technologies is still relatively expensive, although the government now is trying to subsidize, particularly the replacement of gas central heating. But it is a challenge. It's a real challenge to communicate and to communicate why this is so important. Jane Goodall, in her book, talks about this, and she said, facts and figures is not the right way. You've got to tell it through stories.
Yes, absolutely. Totally agree with that. So I'm reading out all these questions from people that you know well, but anyway, I'm going to go on. You talked about the North creating the problems and the South taking the consequences. This is from Eddie. What are you hearing about reparations?
That actually is not in the people I've talked to. That is not something that I've heard talked about actually at all, either from people I've met who are from the global south, and certainly not from people I've met in the north. That's a really interesting point. I don't know why those conversations have not come up in the in the conversations I've had. I would put it down to that's a very, very political matter, and I haven't been talking to politicians, so that might be the sort of reason.
Oh, okay, interesting. So Catherine says, thank you for your messages of hope, which I share. How do we spread this message? Our politicians and those in positions of influence need to help us with this, as well as spreading awareness of the climate emergency, e.g., by facilitating a public national briefing. Yeah, here.
Yeah, and you know, the national emergency briefing is something that you know, just by you going onto YouTube, watching it, liking it, will be, you know, is just a small action that spreads the word. Reading Jane Goodall's book and recommending to your friends that they read that book is a way of spreading some of the optimism. All we can do is what we can do. It's all tiny steps. But of course, as you guys will know, you know, if every single body does a small step, then they, you know, you end up with millions of small steps, billions of small steps being taken, and that's certainly one of the call outs from one of the delegates at the Global Tipping Points conference. He really said that, you know, everyone needs to find what they can do in this transformation, but accept that everything you do is going to just be a very small piece of the puzzle. Even some of the rock stars, as I referred to, of the climate change science, whilst they are having a much bigger impact than someone like me, probably even they would say, but my impact is relatively small. So, you know, and there is this huge global community that is working on these solutions. So that is something else take away and have faith in.
Rosie, I think you should ask your own question.
Excuse me, sorry, Jane. Could I just come back very briefly on that, just to say, while this is being discussed, that there is a film being made of that based on the National Emergency Briefing that is hopefully accessible to a wide range of people, and it's going to be coming out in April. And shown, I probably you know about this, Martin, and shown hopefully be made available to be shown around the country. And the aim is to get local councillors, MPs, anybody who wants to come along to these film showings. So it's a short film, short documentary film, but again based on the much longer, obviously, and more academically.
What's it called, Catherine?
I don't know what it's called, but I can certainly let you know once I know further details. As I said, it's due out in about April by Nick Aldridge and the other people who masterminded the National Emergency Briefing.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, if you let me know as soon as you know, and I'll spread it around.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
No, not at all. Not at all. Very worthwhile interruption. Thank you. Rosie, do you want to ask your own question?
Is that the communication one?
Yeah, your heading's back to front, but.
Oh, right. You see, it looks okay to me. On communication, Martin, how do you think there's a better way of communicating and breaking down this discussion where economically people go, oh, but we can't afford all this climate change stuff. And those of us who've thought about it for a long time are screaming, you can't afford not to. You will find it costs a great deal more if you don't take these actions, only to be told, oh no, you can't frighten people by telling them that. So I'm feeling a bit stuck as to how do you have that conversation, which is just not heard nearly enough to me.
No, and actually on the masters, Cambridge is focusing quite a lot on communication and how we communicate, and almost they were saying, you know, as people who we are teaching and preparing to go out there and be leaders in the sustainability world, you've got to learn to communicate in a world where you don't have power. It's almost like underground. It's almost like, you know, through these sort of meetings that we will communicate and communicate with each other. Because, you know, it's very striking. The National Emergency Briefing was not really covered by mainstream media. It wasn't picked up even the BBC. And so, and certainly not by some of the media organizations whose ownership will be more right of centre. So, you know, although ironically, it's GB News that posted it on its website, the full-length thing. And, you know, GB News should be given credit for doing that. Very surprising, but they did. And it comes back to this point around storytelling. I mean, as those of you who are members of Toastmasters will know, you know, storytelling is the most effective way of getting messages across. But it's storytelling that's in a way that's relevant to the culture in which you are talking. So that storytelling would be very different in Japan or India or China as opposed to the US. Yeah, so it's really difficult. There's no simple answer to your point of sort of we can't scare them, but we've got to brief them on what the truth is. But the problem is you still come down to this tragedy of the commons, as I've said, which is a way systems trip up. It's part of systems thinking, which is has been developed out of MIT in America. It's just at an individual level, it's still rational to continue to use fossil fuels. And until it becomes a point where it's not rational, it's going to be very difficult to really on the main scale, push people over to a more greener, sustainable way of life. But that being said, there is another thing that's very important here. In one conversation I had with a very interesting person, he said, yeah, but we make the mistake of trying to convince everyone. Any change happens by convincing a small number of people who then convince the early adopters. And then once you've got to about 18% of the population, it goes mainstream. So we should stop trying to convince everyone. We should stop, just go for the people who are already interested in hearing the messages. There's a lady called Kate Raworth who was behind the concepts of donut economics. Some of you might have heard of that.
Yeah.
And again, she was speaking at the Global Tipping Points conference. And she was asked, what's her big advice? Because her Donut Economics Action Lab is now working with 50 cities and regions around the globe on implementing the sort of principles of donut economics. And she said, go where the energy is. Just don't bother with areas that aren't energized by this. Go where the energy is, and then you will build from there.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, a colleague of mine said work with the willing. It's a similar idea, isn't it? If you can give somebody a little poke and they'll go, then give them that little poke. Go on.
Just to say, in healthcare, there's a very established organizational change model called quality improvement. And this is a methodology for change that has evolved out of the sort of Toyota quality models and prior to that, sort of ideas coming out of America in the 1930s. And that works exactly the same. There's a chap called Rogers and the diffusion of change model. And that's all about start small, test and learn, and then when you're secure on the change, implement it, and then roll it out first to the willing, and then it will become adopted as a mainstream change in healthcare organizations. So there's a really established way, shall we say, of doing this. The challenge is, over the last 30 years, the human population has grown by 40%. 1.5 billion people have been lifted out of poverty, which is a really good thing. But it's set against that context. And actually, a third point is that the new technologies have only really reached maturity in the last 10 years. So against that context, it's no wonder that emissions have continued to grow. But going forward, those technologies are getting to the point of mass adoption. The population we know is not going to grow by another 40% over the next 30 years because of the birth rates around the world now. So, we're not going to go through the same that we've been through over the last 30 years.
Right. Okay. I'm going to ask you a question from Sarah because I think it's a nice one. Over the course of your studies, what really surprised you, positive and negative? What were the most surprising things?
Well, early on, the first course I did was an online course with Cambridge University. They've done very well at on sales as far as I'm concerned. Was a short 6-week online course. And the two big aha moments that I hadn't appreciated was how agriculture had evolved after the ending of the last ice age. And it is, the theory is because the levels of CO2 stabilized in the atmosphere, and then that made weather patterns predictable, and then humans, or Homo sapiens, began to see that by planting, you could then have a reasonable predictability of harvesting. And we've only domesticated a small number of plants out of the total plant kingdom. But it was that connection between stability of climate and farming, and the risk, therefore, of destabilizing the climate to continued viability of farming, that I'd not appreciated. So that was when I sort of had that, this is all about farming. That was a real, whether you call it positive or negative, but that was a real aha moment. And then the other aha moment was when we were introduced to the concept of planetary limits, which comes from work led by a scientist called Johan Rockström. And that is saying that actually it's not just carbon that's the issue here, but through the great acceleration in the human population, we are now pouring phosphates and nitrates into the natural environment at a rate that the environment cannot absorb. We're putting what they call foreign bodies, but fundamentally plastics and microplastics. I mean, another aha moment. I had no idea. But seed is covered in microplastics because it makes it far more effective and far more efficient in sowing the seeds through mechanized means. But every single blinking seed of wheat has been covered in microplastics for years. So the aha moments along some of these things have been, again, really broadening my understanding that this is not just about carbon. This is about trying to reverse the trend in other planetary limits, which we either have already exceeded and we are destabilizing the environment, or are getting close to. Positive, really on the positive, is again just understanding the sheer scale and effort that is going on, both in commerce as well as in the academic world, to try and change the trajectories that we are on. And that's where, again, I take a huge amount of hope from. We're not going to do it in time to stop the climate changing. Well, the climate has already changed from what I can remember as a child. So, we're beyond that point. But I do believe that there is real hope that after going through a period of changed climate, we can come out the other side. And I've met scientists who sometimes you think, oh my God, you're mad. But I read one paper that a scientist has pulled together arguing for how we can take 1 trillion tons of carbon out of the atmosphere. And it is enormously ambitious. But his argument is, we know theoretically how to do this. It's now just a question of finding how we can do it efficiently and effectively in a way that will work.
Do you think that kind of thing can work?
In time, one of the biggest constraints would be energy. All of this will take a lot of energy. So unless you've got vast amounts of renewable energy, it's not going to work, because otherwise you're just making the problem.
Yes. Using more energy in order to reduce the carbon. Yeah. So we're quite nearly out of time, but Rosie has asked another question here. Rosie, you asked your own question. The one about being a strategy consultant and public opinion.
Well, I'm one of those dreadful people who used to sit there in rooms without any smoke, I'm glad to say, and think about the next 20 years. And for most of the 1990s and 2000s, I was doing that in the company of some of the top brains in electricity companies across sort of Northwest Europe. And every one of them had as a major strategic factor public opinion. In other words, they are customers, because everybody is a customer of an electricity company. that at some point public opinion would change and would tip, and that would make political change easier. And it just seemed absolutely obvious as we stood in those rooms or sat in those rooms. And yet here we are, 2026, and to me, the dial has hardly flickered on public opinion and public acceptance of change. And I just wondered what you think, Martin. What now is the tipping point that might tip this? Because from my perspective of spending a lot of time discussing this, I think it's a real enabler of political change, which is what we really need to see. But
So, yeah.
what will tip the public, if anything?
So we saw with COVID that the public can change its behavior overnight. And again, working in healthcare at the time that the pandemic broke out, one of the things that stunned the healthcare officials, the senior sort of healthcare leaders in our country, was the discipline that the British public showed in lockdown. They couldn't believe it. All of the models that were predicting hospital usage from COVID patients, in their wildest expectations, they did not expect the level of discipline that the British public showed when the threat was communicated to them, and it was here and now, and they could feel it was very real to them. And that is something I think is true of human beings, is they will respond very quickly when they really feel the threat is here and now. And this is one of the sort of inherent problems with climate change, is the threat is here and now, but your house might get damaged by a storm. You might drown in a flood. I might not see the same winds, and I'm only 10 miles down the road, for example. I might not see the same rainfall. I might not, 25 years ago, my half-brother, who was a eminent zoologist and worked on research in rainforests out in Malaysia, told me, when you buy the family house, make sure it's off a floodplain and in the lee of a hill, because the storms are going to get a lot worse. Luckily, I bought a house off a floodplain in the lee of a hill. So there's a certain I'm all right, Jack. And actually, for many of us, we are going to be okay for quite some time. My belief is it's only when people really perceive the threat is very immediate do they really change their behavior. And that is in a sense the problem here. I used to do quite a lot of work connected with security in the loosest sense. So I ran the security operations at Camelot, looking after the National Lottery. And so that was all counter fraud. And I remember an opposite number of mine from the French lottery saying to me, the trouble with security, and he had been in the military, he said, the problem with security is you can tell people until you're blue in the face that we face a security exposure. But their question always is, so when are we going to be breached? And you can't give that answer, because you don't know. You just know that because we've got an exposure, somebody somewhere is going to find that out at some point and take advantage of it. And he said his experience in security was always, you got the money to close the exposure after the exposure had been breached. The classic, close the stable door after the horse has bolted. So there is a certain thing of human nature here, really challenging to make people feel that threat that will change their behavior.
Martin, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
It's low